Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Q&A about history of science and technology. And I see some questions here. I want to emphasize for these live streams, I do encourage people to ask questions along the lines of how would you think about or figure out this or that thing, as well as questions that rely on sort of remembered facts. Okay, so let's take a look at what we have here. Um, it's a question from Eli about progress in understanding a Buddhist philosophy from digging into East Asian history. I would say I'm not yet ready to talk about that sensibly. I'm still in my learning phase there. I can say that in the things that we figured out recently about the Ruliad and our physics project and so on, and the role of the observer in determining the laws of physics as we perceive them, there are many resonances there, both with Buddhist, East Asian philosophy kinds of concepts, and ideas from traditional Western philosophers, particularly around Kant and Leibniz and people like that. And I have to say that I feel like I'm still untangling just what those relationships are. It is kind of interesting for me, having understood these things from the point of view of science, and then seeing how the science that I understand, which feels pretty well grounded, at least to me, relates to things that people have discussed philosophically in ways that are much, at least for me, much less well grounded. I'm much less able to say, yes, I can really confirm that that argument makes sense when it's a philosophical argument than I can when it's an argument that feels like it's grounded in kind of formal scientific ideas. Let's see. Okay, there's a question here from Megan. How do we address the interesting ways that footnotes in history have led to knowledge? How do we address multiple issues of publication within different texts and problems of translation? What happens to the origin of a text? Well, let's see, there are a bunch of different things there. I have to say that footnotes are often the places where the most interesting things get said, because somehow people, when they're writing the formal part of a text, are very uptight, very precise. And then it's kind of like, well, by the way, let's mention these things that are in footnotes. And I find that all the time in reading historical material, that the really best stuff is the footnotes. It kind of reminds me of reading, financial statements or something, where the funky stuff, the juicy stuff is in the footnotes as well. Footnotes are a place where people feel like they're more relaxed in what they're writing. Now, I have to say, in my own efforts of trying to write sort of expository material, I have kind of tried to increasingly not go in the direction of the footnotes are the best thing by kind of integrating more informal kinds of ways of saying things right into the main text. Now, on the subject of footnotes, I will have to say that my big book, A New Kind of Science, that came out in 2002, it's a 1,200-page book, and I have to say that the notes there, not following my own principle here, the notes there are often the things that I find the most valuable to look at. It's kind of what happens is there's a main narrative, but then when I wrote the notes to that book, which are hundreds of pages of notes, those notes are kind of hard-hitting point things. They don't have to give all of the kind of the setup, the contextualization. They're just like, boom, here's a thing. And for me, that has meant that the information density of those notes is probably higher than the information density of the main text, even if those notes don't work unless you sort of have the context of the main text. But it's as I say, I think that when did footnotes come in? Well, I think the very earliest scientific journal type presentations, things like Proceedings of the Royal Society from the late 1600s, I don't think they had footnotes. I'm trying to remember whether they did, but there's, I mean, the other issue with footnotes, by the way, is where do you put them? Because, you're laying out pages And there's sort of a question, you can get into this horrible situation where as soon as if you don't have the footnote there, the place where the footnote would be is still on that page. But as soon as you put the footnote there, it's taking up some room on that page. You get into this kind of infinite loop of how do you typeset the thing. Now, in the days before computerized typesetting, that's sort of one had to kind of think that through by hand. With computerized typesetting, it can get much funkier. But and it's not so obvious how you typeset a thing sometimes when it has to be put on pages like that. I think another thing to say about footnotes and texts and so on is there's this whole question when you're dealing with academic journals, for example, the paper comes out, it's in this issue of the journal, it's done. And there isn't sort of a revised version that comes out in sort of a subsequent issue of the journal. Now, as a practical matter, academics often get themselves into this situation where they're essentially publishing the same paper over and over again because they're gradually sort of modernizing it, and they're having to, like, there's no way to go back and say, well, I want to change what was in that paper. Modern times of mostly electronic publication, there could be, but that's not the convention of that domain. Whereas with books, it's pretty routine to say there's a first edition, there's a second edition, and so on. In each subsequent edition, you make changes. I have to say that with many scientific kind of new presentations of material, I'm not sure that the later editions have been a positive. I mean, a famous example of that is Charles Darwin, his Origin of Species, which went through a whole bunch of editions. The first edition, he kind of made his points. By the second and third edition, there'd been all these people who said, but Mr. Darwin, what about this and that and the other? And so he kept on adding, according to Professor so-and-so, this or that could happen. Let me give an argument for why Professor so-and-so is wrong. And you see that a lot in the later editions of Origin of Species. And the fact is, nobody remembers the points that Professor so-and-so was making. They were kind of washed away as, Darwin was right, Professor so-and-so's point was wrong. But in the days when in the the book came out in 1859, so in the 1860s or something, maybe that point loomed large, and so Darwin felt, I've got to address that. And in the third edition, I've got to explain why Professor so-and-so didn't make any sense. And so my own view, like, for example, my big book, New Kind of Science, I intended to write it once. It will be, in 2027, it will be its 25th anniversary. And I'm kind of wondering, should we print a new version of it? The fact is, very little that's in that book it is what it is, so to speak. And it is a bunch of computer experiments and a bunch of conclusions, all of which I think I still stand behind. The number of even typos that have shown up in it is very small. There are things that I've extended substantially. There are many footnotes to that book that have become 50-page documents now. And in fact, in the online version of the book, we're gradually adding these stripes that say, see future developments here and there. But what's there is still perfectly valid, even if there could be more said. And so it's again, I knew perfectly well this phenomenon that later editions often degrade the main point, partly because they're batting down issues that sort of come up in that day. I was looking actually at New Kind of Science, and there's an introductory part that talks about some of the sort of existing theories and ideas of the day, which was 2002. And I have to say, that's the part of the book which, if anything, is the most out of date, because I'm kind of talking about things like catastrophe theory, which people don't talk about much now, things like general systems theory, which people don't talk about very much now. There are things where I'm kind of dealing with the things which were contextualized, contextually useful in 2002 and have become less so. But the main text is perfectly modern today, which is nice to see. When it comes to the translation of books and so on, I know my own book, New Kind of Science, that's really difficult to translate. And there's a full translation into French. There have been attempts to translate in a bunch of languages, but it's hard to translate because it was written quite carefully and tightly, and it makes use of kind of the way of communicating in English that is not necessarily easy to translate to other places. I have to say, I'm reminded, this is a sort of, I suppose, personal history thing that I was reminded of recently. My mother, who was a philosophy professor in Oxford, and actually wrote her PhD thesis on anthropology, in the early 1960s, she somehow wound up with the task of translating a book by a French anthropologist named Claude Lévi-Strauss. And Claude Lévi-Strauss was already quite famous, but became even more famous. And this was a book, I'm not sure I could necessarily represent his theories. They went under the rubric of structuralism, sort of a formalization, a scientificization of anthropology that I don't know enough to be able to comment really seriously on. But anyway, my mother had somehow Lévi-Strauss had sort of picked her on as the right person to translate his book. And the book in French was called La Pensée Sauvage, which is kind of a pun in French. And the French, it can either mean the wild pansy or the kind of native savage mind. And the French edition of the book had a picture of a wild pansy flower on the cover. And I think on the back cover, it had a picture of a wolverine. And so there was a big question when that was going to be translated into English, what should the title be? Because it was, the pun was not replicable in English. And so, in fact, there was a very spirited correspondence which between my mother and Lévi-Strauss about this question of what the title should be. I think Lévi-Strauss was really pushing for the title The Wild Pansy, which had many problems in English. And eventually, the title that got picked was The Savage Mind, which was it's kind of unfortunate title because the whole point of the book was to sort of move away anthropology from what it had been in the 1800s, talking about the natives and the savages and so on, to a more kind of even-handed treatment of indigenous or whatever kind of anthropology versus the supposedly refined Western anthropology and so on. But anyway, that was an example of difficulties of translation and what you communicate by those different translations into different languages. And I think in the end, there was a whole giant meltdown about that translation. In fact, somebody was recently writing about it. It's sort of an interesting story. And somewhere there is a big pile of all the correspondence between my mother and Lévi-Strauss. And it's somewhere in a bunch of boxes that I have, which I'm slowly going through over the years. And eventually we're going to find it. But I did happen to find a note from my mother from a long time ago in which she mentions that the folder of letters exchanged about the translation was far thicker than the manuscript of the translation itself. So that kind of gives me a clue about what's there. And I'm looking forward to finding those letters, which are probably in French, which fortunately I can more or less read. But that's an example of the difficulties of language translation of intellectual works. Let's see. Gus is asking, do you think weird names are an advantage in academics? E.g., one of the translators, the new edition of Philosophical Investigations, is a certain PMS hacker, not something Des says they would have remembered otherwise. I seem to remember that person as a philosopher in Oxford who was a friend of my mother's, actually, so small world. But in any case, it is an interesting question, sort of the memorability of names. And I certainly noticed that as different kind of types of names have showed up in, for example, the scientific literature, and even different transliterations of different non-English characters and so on have showed up. I mean, for me, with a last name that begins with a W, it always used to be the case that in sort of scientific lists of names, I'd be in a reasonably small sample, I'd be the last name alphabetically, until many transliterations of Chinese names came in with X's and Z's, and until there were many Chinese names sort of on scientific documents. And now I'm far from the end of the alphabet. So that's sort of a thing. But I certainly notice that there are names that I find it easier to remember than others. I'm pretty decent usually at remembering names. But there are ones where I'm more used to the sound of names from some particular culture or whatever than from other ones, and it takes me more effort to remember the exotic ones. But I think there's always the question of you have a name, and for example, do you remember how to spell it? Do you know how to pronounce it? I know, for example, famously the tallest mountain in the world, which was sort of determined by a surveyor named George Everest. And of course, everybody calls it Mount Everest, no doubt to the annoyance of his descendants, because he himself said his name as Everest. But it's something that sort of decays quickly in kind of the typical translation. I mean, it's always an issue when one is kind of describing people, places, things that are not in one's native language. Should one make an effort to pronounce them in ways that have possibly phonemes that are not even present in one's native language, if that's English or something like this, or should one just give up and anglicize it? I've always taken the point of view one just has to give up and anglicize it, because you don't have to go very far before you get to phonemes that, for example, I can't even make. So sort of you have to give up when. Let's see. Okay, lots of different questions here. Brady asks, who came up with floating point arithmetic and what is it? Okay, so the first computers, so the main question is, if you've got a number with a decimal point in it, not an exact number like an integer, but a number with a decimal point, how do you represent that? And in particular, how do you represent a number that could be very big or very small? It could be trillions in size, or it could be a trillionth in size. How do you best represent that? And kind of the idea, the notion of scientific notation had been, that must have come in, I would guess that was in, I'm trying to think when I've seen it in serious use. It was certainly in serious use in the 1800s, 6.6 times, 6 times 10 to the 23. That was Avogadro's number, for example. That was that sort of notation was in wide use by at least the mid to late 1800s. The origin of the idea of numbers that have decimal points in them is fairly recent. I mean, that was, I think, Simon Stevin from the 1600s, and Baron Napier, also from the 1600s. Napier invented the idea of logarithms, which is kind of what then, and Stevin, I think, invented the idea of decimal points. That's a comparatively recent invention. I mean, back in earlier times, people had represented numbers with fractional pieces using fractions. I mean, famously, for example, while the Babylonians were using fractions with 1/60th, 1/60th squared, and so on, the Egyptians tended to write numbers as something plus 1/7, plus 1/15 or something, plus 1 over whatever, so-called Egyptian fractions. Those were sort of different approaches to dealing with fractional numbers. But the idea of kind of a decimal where you would just put a point and then just put a bunch of digits there in that sort of positional way, that was an idea of the 1600s. Now, when it came to using computers, setting up computers, the first computers, I think the things like the ENIAC from 1946, they used fixed point arithmetic. They had numbers where it was kind of like an integer, all in base 2 by that time, but it was an integer where you could say, okay, this represents this number with a decimal point in a particular place. I don't know exactly when the idea of using a separate mantissa, that's in the 6 times 10 to the 23, that's the 6th part, versus the exponent. I don't know quite when that came in. What was certainly true by well, it came in sometime in the 1960s, but I don't know exactly when. What was then established was the IEEE floating point standard, which was kind of a way of saying how the numbers should be set up, and then some things about the arithmetic that we get on with them. The person who was much involved with that was a chap called Vel Kahan, who I have to say I think he and I did not really see eye to eye on many things. One of the issues with kind of the IEEE floating point standard is you have a number and it has a certain number of digits of precision. Let's say it has 53 digits, 53 binary bits that represent its mantissa, and I don't know what it is, 8, 9 bits that represent the exponent. And then the thing is, when you do arithmetic with that number, but you don't keep track of the precision that should come out of that arithmetic. So let's say you have two numbers that are really nearby, 1.00001 and just 1, and you subtract those two numbers. The number that you get is 0.001, which is a number that really has less precision than that 1 number. But the way it's represented in the IEEE floating point standard, it has the same number of bits in its mantissa, so it looks as if it has the same precision. So it's very easy to get yourself into a situation where you have computations that you're doing, where there are cancellations that happen, round off, and you end up with a situation where basically none of the digits that are actually coming out are digits that mean anything. They're all garbage that comes from the innards of the computation. They don't actually have a content, so to speak. Well, in the IEEE floating point standard, there's no tagging of that. So when you do a computation, you might just get all the digits. It'll say the answer is 3.784, but it turns out none of those digits are significant or correct. They're all things that were kind of ground down to nothing in the course of the computation. And so you write down, okay, my answer is 3.7, whatever it is, and every digit you write down is wrong, but you don't know it. Now, in Wolfram language or Mathematica, from the very beginning, nearly 40 years ago now, we kind of used the idea of tagging the precision of numbers so that you can tell whether you ground down that number to have no precision, so that none of those digits you got were significant. And I had a very public exchange once, must have been, probably late 1980s, I think it was, yeah, with Vel Kahan about this very topic, in which sort of I was just pointing out that many people will just get wrong answers as a result of this kind of these cancellations and so on, and won't know they've got wrong answers. And Vel Kahan's position was, well, then they should just study the numerical analysis of their computations. Well, as I pointed out to him, his day job was being a numerical analysis professor at Berkeley, so it's good for his business, so to speak, to say everybody who does numerical calculations on a computer must be a proper sort of certified numerical analyst, but that's not reality. And much of what people do with computation is they're just going to do it, and they're trusting that the folks who make the software systems that they're using will have dealt with making sure that the numbers they get come out correct. But the notion that this idea of sort of standardizing how numbers are represented, before that standardization, there had been lots of different choices of how you make some piece of the mantissa, how you make some piece of the exponent, and so on, exactly how you encode the number in the bits in the memory of the computer. It's still the case that there are these two different ways, big endian and little endian, ways of representing numbers. So the issue is memory in computers is typically typically referenced in terms of bytes, a byte being 8 bits. And so you can say this is the location of that byte. And then there's the question of when you make an integer, for example, how do you lay out the bytes? Is the high order numbers the most significant, the hundreds column or whatever, is that to the left or to the right of the other byte of things? And so for a long time there was sort of different machines had big endian versus little endian kind of layout of their bits. And for example, in the source code of Wolfram language, I don't know if it's still the case. I haven't looked at that part in gazillion years, but we used to have this program that we would run as part of the pre-compilation step in our low-level things like C code and so on, which would determine for every machine where things were going to be compiled, what was the layout of bits and numbers so that we could do the right thing when it came to implementing algorithms in those terms. I think there's been more standardization now of that. But one of the things that happened with floating point was that there were all these different choices of exactly how you lay out the bits, and that got largely standardized. Now, in the end, it's kind of like it's a double, a 64-bit number that is going to be partly used for mantissa, partly used for exponent. It's some sort of quad precision, 128 bits became common, even by the time, by the time the C language, by the time I started using the C language in 1978, double was sort of the pretty much default designation for a floating point number. You could have a float that will be a 32-bit floating point number, but I'm pretty sure well, maybe that's not right. Maybe there were still floats floating around in 1978. By the time we were building Wolfram language in 1986, I think doubles were pretty much what one ended up using. Let's see. Here from Johnny. What do you think about scientific collaboration in the age before technology? How did ancient researchers and scientists collaborate with each other? Well, the idea of like writing academic papers and putting many names on the top of the paper, that has been a thing that has inflated considerably over the years. When I used to write academic papers back in the 1970s and 1980s, I would say in a field like physics, perhaps half, third of all papers were single author papers. Now it's a tiny fraction. In mathematics, back in those days, almost all papers were single author papers. Now a large fraction are multi-author papers. In fields like life sciences, I think it's been a convention for much longer that there are many more authors on papers, and there are different conventions, like the head of the lab will put their name on the paper at the end and things like that. And there are sort of different conventions. In very recent times, last decade or two, there's been more of a footnoting of who did what in the paper, which I think is sort of an interesting idea. And it makes a less definitive cutoff of whose name is there and whose name isn't there, so to speak. Now, in more ancient times, a lot of publication happened in books, and books were mostly single author books. I mean, all of the sort of famous scientific books, it was just one author. And I think the same is true if you look at I don't know, Proceedings of the Royal Society back from its earliest times in the 1600s. I think that was, one person was reading a paper before the society, and it's one person was out, in front of the group reading their paper, and it wasn't two people, in stereo, so to speak, doing it. So it tended to have a one author character to it. Now, in terms of collaboration, there certainly were many, many, many scientists who exchanged letters. I mean, Charles Darwin, who we keep on mentioning here, was a huge writer of letters. I mean, I'm sure he probably spent about the same time every day writing letters as I spend processing email, a few hours. That was a good medium of communication. Now, it's worth realizing that letters were not as slow as one might have expected, particularly in a country like England that's comparatively small. And for example, I happened to study at one time Ada Lovelace and Charles Babbage, who were kind of working together in the 1840s. and who lived, I don't know, a few miles apart in London. And at a certain time, then there were, I think, 14 mail deliveries per day. So things were being delivered, one of them would write a letter, and certainly you could see in the chains of correspondence, which has still been preserved, that there will be multiple exchanges in one day between them by letter. They were handwriting the letters and they were, mailing them, and the mail would get delivered, or sometimes they would have somebody just deliver their letter by hand, go the couple of miles and deliver the letter. So it was pretty easy to get, communication like that. And I would say that it was really a convention, even by the 1600s, there was a lot of letter writing going on of people, Leibniz and Newton were writing letters to each other, the Bernoullis and Newton and so on, they were writing letters to each other. And often one of the nice features of letters is they often did get preserved. And, you can actually read the original letters. Perhaps some of the certainly earlier electronic communications won't have been preserved. Nowadays, probably there's a bit more archiving. I've certainly archived every email I've dealt with since 1989, but I didn't archive emails. I started using email in 1976 or 77, and I don't have an archive of my email between 1976, 7, and 1989. I have only very incomplete archives from that time. So there's certainly a period of non-archived electronic communication, but then letters, for example, in my case, I have about a third of a million pages of paper that I interacted with in the years before I went largely electronic, which was by the mid-1980s. And I've now, for some time, I've had scans of all of those pages. It's very useful to me when I'm looking for things, and it's like, well, that was a thing that I dealt with in 1980. Well, it's probably on paper and it's been scanned. The only imperfection there is that while the printed stuff and the typewritten stuff is all OCRable, the handwritten stuff has not been convertible mostly. I mean, we'll probably do another scan of these things this year because I think handwriting recognition has gotten better, and it's worth redoing it. The previous iteration, it got some of my handwriting, but not all of it. My handwriting is actually it's probably better than it is now, but it's idiosyncratic at least, and so not something that's super easy for a handwriting recognizer to pick up. So let's see. So I mean, I think in the notion of collaboration, again, in very ancient times, I don't know what the kind of letter writing traditions of antiquity were like, but certainly people would go to places. They would go to the Library of Alexandria. They would go to Plato's Academy, and there'd be plenty of interaction there. Then there was sort of, I suppose, collaborative things like Plato and Socrates, but it was, Plato was the writer and put his name on the books, so to speak, even though they might be about conversations with Socrates. Let's see. Let's see, there's a question here. From Tommy, do you think there is hidden mathematics or geometry in the biblical writings or the Egyptian pyramids? It's a fun question. I mean, one of the things that people often say is, look at this arrangement of stones somewhere. Look, it perfectly corresponds to some astronomical coincidence. It must have been set up for that purpose. Oftentimes, it's really hard to tell what's a coincidence and what's intentional. I mean, there are things where, yes, it was arranged to be precisely this way at the solstice. Maybe that's convincing. But by the time it's like, well, when you draw this line and that line and that line and so on, it's very easy to have a coincidence there. And I think most of the time, those things are really not significant, and they're mostly just coincidences. Now, having said that, there's the question of when people were writing things, whether it was, I don't know, Dante's Inferno or pieces of the Bible or whatever else, people have always thought at some level that math is cool, and math is sort of somehow a significant thing. And so I tend to think people have played with math more than one might expect. And people have chosen to put math into things, even just because they think it's kind of cool. And it's not necessarily what its fundamental significance is, whether they were sort of hiding a message, whether they were just putting it in there because it's kind of a thing that adds to the texture of the document. I'm not sure, but I would think that there are, when it comes to sort of the hidden messages of, was there, if you read the first letter of this and you add a 7 to it and you do that and do the other, I think a lot of that ends up being coincidences. But having said that, there was a tradition of hiding messages in texts at different times in history. I mean, it's worth remembering that the idea of encryption that is pretty familiar today, people were very confused by that. I mean, for example, the so-called Caesar cipher that I think might have actually been used by Julius Caesar in dispatches that he was sending out, where the Caesar cipher takes the letters of the alphabet and just shifts them by some number of letters. And the fact that that would be a plausible cipher, that your typical messenger or whatever else, or the person who hijacked your messenger, that they wouldn't be able to understand that, seems very surprising to us today. We're much more kind of formal and mathematicized today. And many people would expect that if you just shift the letters in some message, that, yeah, somebody would figure that out. But in the time of Julius Caesar, I think things were that there wasn't, I think there was much less ambient understanding of formal things. And so that was a reasonable cipher to use. And so then that led to, I would say, well, there were more elaborate versions of that, Vignère ciphers and things like this, where so-called running key ciphers, where instead of shifting the letters by a fixed amount, you would shift them by an amount which changed as you went through the document, so to speak, where the shift was 2 and then 3 and then 4 and so on. And that was kind of the state of the art of cryptography until kind of the late 1800s. And it was, so those kinds of things were sufficient to make things secret for most practical purposes. And it was only when sort of encryption machines became common. Well, two things happened. One was code books, where you would have this book that would be, if you say antelope, it really means, the army is attacking from the north type thing, or something like that. And where you would have just these code words that had translations. You had to have a code book that gave you the translation of those things. But then by the early 20th century, there was starting to be machines, for example, these rotor machines, and that was which led to, for example, the Enigma machine used by the Germans in World War II. That was a rotor-based machine that was sort of electromechanical type machine, but that was kind of the next stage. But the idea that you would write in code, and I don't know. I think some of the from British history, I'm trying to remember. Maybe Mary Queen of Scots wrote something in code to somebody. And what did that mean? I mean, it meant that it was some combination, I think, of code book type stuff and sort of strange ways to have the seventh letter of the sentence be the thing that you picked out, and so on. So that was a thing that people did. And I don't know to what extent sort of famous documents ended up having that kind of material in them, and to what extent it was, you were trying to send your letter so that it wouldn't be caught by the other side's people. More when it was a question of sort of letters about things of the moment, rather than documents that were intended to be passed down through the ages. I also think that in the subject of sort of numbers and the mysticism of numbers, there was quite a lot in, for example, architecture, like the whole tradition of the Freemasons and the whole how do you build a cathedral and have it not fall down type thing. There was a lot of kind of geometry and numerical kinds of things that had to be learnt in order to make a cathedral that didn't fall down, for example. And that was sort of semi-secret knowledge. And so I think, again, that's a place where sort of the idea of numbers and you sort of kept things about numbers secret was again a concept. Let's see. I'm going to run out of time soon here, but let me see what I can pick up here. Let's see. Oh boy, all kinds of questions here. Um, um, Question here from Des. If you woke up tomorrow in ancient Greece with a pouch of gold coins, what sort of computing machines do you think you could have fabricated? Well, we have this one example of a computing machine from antiquity, the Antikythera device, which is this thing with, I don't know how many, 20 something, maybe more than that, cogs. It's a kind of mechanical computer that was sort of it seems like it was an astronomical computer that computed sort of a first approximation to eclipses and computed these kind of astronomical events. We just have no idea what the kind of ecosystem around that machine was. There's some indication it came from the town of Syracuse in Sicily, which is where Archimedes lived. It's been for a long time my kind of whimsical belief or something that Archimedes might have been in the same business that I've been in for so many years of making kind of tools for mathematical computation. And maybe he was involved in making the Antikythera device. But it's a very funny situation because we just have one of it from this one shipwreck that was discovered in the late 19th century off this island called Antikythera near the island of Kythera. It's an awful lot of things that you see that are sort of notable pieces of sculpture and so on from antiquity actually came from that very same shipwreck. And so it's surprising we have only one of it. I think that there is indication that there were more of it back in antiquity. For example, I think Cicero mentions the existence of such a thing in something he wrote, and there probably wasn't just one of it. But what level of technology one needed to make those cogs accurate enough to make that kind of device, I don't know how prevalent that technology was. And I don't know, the idea of inventing sort of this notion of you can do computation with cogs and so on. I don't know whether I would have been smart enough back in antiquity to have figured that out. I can say only one thing for myself, which was when I was probably 5, 6 years old. I did notice you could take two rulers and you could slide them next to each other, and you could use that to do arithmetic computation. And it's one of the many reasons why I never learned arithmetic too well. I only learned it kind of in adulthood, I think, for very practical reasons that I would just, I was supposed to do some arithmetic. I could just take out two rulers and, some teacher would probably be very confused why I had two rulers on my desk. But that was a very simple form of slide rule, addition slide rule that I could figure out at age, I don't know, 5 or 6 or something. So I don't know, maybe in the ambient, technology of a couple of thousand years ago, one might have been able to get to at least that point. The idea of logarithms, for example, which is what you need to make a slide rule that can do multiplication, that was an idea from the 1600s. And that I think would have been that's a challenging idea that would not have been so easy to come up with. It certainly wasn't historically come up with. Doofus comments, why is there only one species of human beings? Isn't that kind of absurd? It's one of the things where there's sort of a time scale for different for sort of different kinds of evolution, the time scale for migration from one part of sort of the Earth to another versus the time scale for the time scale for when there were land bridges between different continents and so on, versus the timescale for evolution. I mean, we certainly know there were other kinds of hominids, and we certainly know that, for example, in Neanderthals, we all have a bit of Neanderthal DNA, and the blue-eyed of us have that extra bit that is just that particular gene. Um, but that the fact that there was sort of one winning hominid is, I don't know. It's hard to know quite why that happened and whether there was some one particular sort of evolutionary discovery that whether it was language or whether it was something else about sort of operating in tribes or something, I don't know, that or whether it was something, to do with figuring out what you could eat, or I don't really know, that led to the predominance of that. I think there are many questions about what existed before. There are even questions about what existed in terms of life as a whole. I would suspect that life as we know it now on Earth is not the first version of life. There were probably earlier versions of life that provided the environment that made it possible to have later generations of life, that provided the kind of cocoons necessary to have sort of life 2.0, 3.0, 4.0 be able to operate, so that which would otherwise have been sort of too fragile for that to have existed without sort of the cocooning of more primitive forms of life. And I don't know the extent to which any of the things that exist in modern humans were sort of enabled by things that could have been the result of earlier hominid species and so on. But it is certainly, one has the belief that, well, certainly the Neanderthals coexisted with modern humans. I believe the what is it, Homo floresiensis, these kind of much shorter stature hominids probably existed, maybe existed well up into historical times, and who knows, maybe they're the all of these things where it's kind of like the, I don't know, leprechauns, the this, that, the other, these things which were sort of mythical. Maybe they actually were a real thing, just like one has the expectation that dragons, people talk about all these dragons that existed. Quite possibly those were fossils. That belief came from having seen fossils of dinosaurs, because fossils of dinosaurs, it wasn't really identified what they were until the 1830s or so. But people have certainly seen those fossils long before that time. And so that was kind of like that, well, then there be dragons, so to speak, became a kind of a mythical idea, but it was based on something real. And that might very well be the case for these other, human species might have coexisted even up to sort of historical times. I mean, I tend to think that when there is enough kind of belief about something, historical belief about something, there's usually something to it, so to speak. Like, for example, it was the city of Troy. People didn't know it was a real city. They thought it might just be a story in the Iliad and so on, until mid 1800s, I think. Still out in mystery land is Atlantis, where it was discussed by people in antiquity, but there isn't an obvious, oh, here's where it is. But I tend to think many of these things where there's sort of a repeating myth around it, the sort of repeating supposedly historical myth around something, that there probably was something behind it, even if it might have been adapted in many ways for what from what actually happened. All right, maybe one more quick thing, and then I need to go. Let's see. KD asks, in hindsight, would Computational Principles of Natural Philosophy been a good title for a new kind of science? Actually, it's a pretty good idea. I think, though, that the term natural philosophy was a bit out of style. I think that in 2002, that probably would have seemed like a rather pompous title. Now, of course, if you translate it into Latin, Principia, like Principia Mathematica, Newton's original book was Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, Principia Mathematica. Oh gosh, can I do natural philosophy in Latin? No, not in real time. Um, the concept of computation, that word computare, I think in Latin is to compute. Um, so there is sort of a Latinized version of that. I think that would have been. I have certainly thought about, particularly having built a product named Mathematica. One can't help but think one should also have a thing called Principia, and yes, actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I remember that was one of my kind of whimsical thoughts about titles for NKS was something around Principia, but I thought that was too silly. And I have to say, just in terms of naming and the irony of naming, when we were first building Mathematica, what's now Wolfram Language, um, an early name for it was Omega, and we kind of gave up on that name for a variety of reasons. It was kind of it was kind of in the family of things like C and so on as a name of a programming language, but we had kind of a grander expectations, and so we were like, it's Greek and it's the end of the alphabet type thing. Of course, the irony of that is many years after the release of Mathematica in 1988, in 2009 we released Wolfram Alpha. So over that period of time, over those 20 years, we went from Omega to Alpha, so to speak, in the things that we produced. Well, let's see. All right, I think I should wrap up here and go to my next thing. But there's lots of interesting questions here. I look forward to addressing another time. Well, thanks for joining me, and see you another time.